When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello guys, welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, I want to talk about George R.R. Martin and how he views House of the Dragon. He's been coming out with a couple not blog posts, kind of talking about some of the stuff in the show. And I get this question pretty much every single stream that I talk about House of the Dragon. So I wanted to just make a video on it, give people my thoughts. So, if you want my expanded thoughts, if you ask me and I don't really respond that much in a stream or something, here is where it is. So we're going to talk about it in today's video and kind of detail some of the things that maybe George feels about the show and maybe things that they cut or maybe things he maybe doesn't agree with in the show, and maybe even what his actual role with the show is. Like how much of an input does he have in the actual show? But before we did, I want to give a massive thank you to my Patreons and my members for supporting me on this channel. And also, if you did want to become one, you do get videos early. As soon as I put them on YouTube, they go directly to you instead of having to wait all week. And also, I do have an exclusive video each week for those people. So let's get into the video. So right away, I want to kind of look at some of the Nota blog posts. So we had a Nota blog post where George R. Martin seemed to kind of geek out about, dragons in his world and how they go about things and how it's been done a little bit differently in House of the Dragon. If you look at things like the sigil, that's always been different in the book. And even the early Game of Thrones, like Targaryen sigil had it right, but then they started screwing it up later on. So George R. R. Martin has just seemed like he's had a bunch of little minor geek out moments, and he even talked about the episode, and he kind of alluded to not really maybe agreeing how Blood and Cheese was done, in terms of it was not what the book version was, and I made a whole video about that if you want to check out the differences between the two. But in terms of the show as a whole, let's get down to the main question. What does he think about House of the Dragon? So I think right now, I think he's kind of in the same boat as I am, where I think the show is good, but I think it could be so much better. And so if you look at George R. R. Martin, one thing that Ricky, one of my friends, Voice of Old Town, fellow YouTuber that I work with a lot, has talked about, and something I agree with, is George R. R. Martin during Game of Thrones really did not talk about the show much after maybe the first 2 or 3 seasons. And why was that? Well, eventually the story wasn't even his story anymore. The lack of quality as the show went on, he just kind of went radio silent. He didn't talk about it until after the show finished. And so when you think about that idea, him talking about House of the Dragon, even if it is maybe slightly negative at times, is still a good thing because it shows that he's still invested. He cares about House of the Dragon. He doesn't want to see it probably go to what eventually Game of Thrones became. And so to me, the way I look at it is I think George R. R. Martin is very critical of this work. I have been someone that I think people really feel like I'm very critical of the show, especially episode 7. And we're not really even talking about episode 7 in this video, but, I was not a big fan. And I know the general consensus was that it was a good episode. Things didn't work for me. But George R. R. Martin, I think if you take that, if I'm critical of the show, he's going to be 10 times as much as critical than I am, because think about this. It's his world. These are his characters he made. And so I think there are things that are bothering him. He seemed to allude to the Nettle storyline in terms of dragons are not really, going out looking for food and all these things. And so I think, to me, what George R. R. Martin was kind of alluding to was that the Nettle storyline seems to be completely removed and given to other characters in House of the Dragon. And it's especially, disappointing, I think, if you're George, because that was one of his best characters that he wrote in Fire and Blood. There are not a lot of characters that are, fairly unique because we don't see it through their perspectives and things like that. Nettles is one of those characters where it seems like George added a little bit more, because Nettles was our kind of connection to the small folk, and seeing, what that relationship was between Daemon. Was it them actually having a father-daughter type relationship, or was it something different? There's a lot there with the Nettles character, and I think George as a person is looking at that, and I think he's very disappointed that they're not going that route. I think you have that mixed in with some of the changes that maybe haven't been executed as well. I think the one I would point to is episode 3 with Alicent and Rhaenyra. I don't think it was executed as well. I get what the point of it was, but I just don't think it was executed that well. You look at Blood and Cheese, where I think as a book fan, it could have been much more. I think the entire way was paved in the book. It's one of the few scenes we get detailed kind of what is said and what happens. And so I think you look at all these things, and I think George is critical of the show because he wants it to be really good. And I think he sees you know, what I think a lot of fans see is that this show could be so much better. Like, not to say that it's bad, right? You know, I might be not feeling great about episode 7, but as a whole, season 2's been good. I think it's taking it that next step and getting it to being a great television show where we're not having questions, you know, each episode. Like, even though the general consensus has been pretty good about episode 7, you know, think about episode 6. I was somebody that really liked episode 6. A lot of people don't like episode 6. Episode 5, people are all over the place. Episode 4, everybody seems to like. Episode 3, again, kind of a divisive episode. Episode 2 seems to be praised, and then episode 1 is, I would say it's still a good episode. I think most people agree it's a good episode, but I think they were a little divisive on how Blood and Cheese worked, and I think Blood and Cheese works pretty good for the casual audience, people that don't know what happens in Fire and Blood, but I think for most book readers, they recognize that it could have been so much more. And so the general I look at is that, so the way I kind of rationalize it, I think George really cares about House of the Dragon and does like it, but I think he wants it to be more. So let's then take a step forward and look at George R.R. Martin's involvement, because there has been, you know, questionable changes. And if he liked Nettles so much, well, why isn't Nettles in the show? Like, you would think George R.R. Martin would have more control or more, you know, input into what should have been in the seasons. And I think it's one of those things where George is heavily involved with House of the Dragon. I do think that's clear, especially season 1. I think he was a big part of it. But I think there are certain things where George can't get his way. And so I think there's some things where the show might have, Ryan Connell and crew might have a different, you know, vision for what they want to do. And that's yet to be seen. And that's why, like, I can't really criticize the Nettles thing yet. I really would have liked to see Nettles in House of the Dragon, but we just don't know what the alternative is, what they're going for, and what their vision is. Like, we can speculate at it, but we just don't know yet. And so until season 3 kind of wraps up and we kind of see some of how those things changed and impacted the story, we just don't know how that's going to play out. And so I think right now, George is someone that he's not like George Lucas with Star Wars, where it's like he has no input at all, but I don't think he has like complete control over everything that they can put in there, because if that was the case, I think these seasons would take much longer to come out. George would be much more articulate and nitpicky on those things, and there's just things that George is not going to be able to get in there. So yeah, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on what you think about George and his view of House of the Dragon. I would say he's probably positive of it, but we just don't know. We're not in his head. And yeah, I think, to me, we'll see how the finale works out on Sunday and how the season concludes. Right now, I'd say it's a good season, just has issues, you know, here and there. And we'll talk about it for the whole season in episode 8 on Sunday. Check us out. We'll be live on Ricky's channel, I do believe, right after the episode, Voice of Old Towns. And I hope you guys all enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.